Welcome to the first ever event sponsored by the Louisville chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. We thank you for joining us for this presentation from Professor Thomas Lambert, an economist at U of L. If there's more information you would like at the end of this session, please email ccllouisvillechapter@gmail.com. Citizens Climate Lobby started in 2007 when Marshall Sanders was challenged by a lady in a nursing home to do something about climate after he had given a presentation on climate change. Together, they got 29 people to start CCL. CCL is now an international organization with 600 chapters. The picture here shows Lobby Day probably in June of 2018. Since CCL started lobbying, we have met with at least every member of Congress and the Senate multiple times. After trial and error, CCL identified that the best approach to fixing the climate is the carbon fee and dividend approach. This approach results in reducing carbon while ensuring that the poor did not carry the burden of change on their backs. Carbon fee and dividend is effective, it's good for people, and it's good for the economy. It's good for the economy in two ways. First of all, it puts money in the pockets of everyday households so that they can spend it. It also prompts innovation so that people and businesses will find better ways of doing what they're doing without using carbon. This creates jobs. Finally, the Citizens Climate Lobby way is a bipartisan way. Everyone needs to be at the table, no matter what side of the aisle they start on. Everyone needs to come together to be a part of the solution. CCL exists to create the political will to create climate solutions by enabling individual breakthroughs in the exercise of personal and political power. We started lobbying in 2008. In 2019, Representatives Francis Rooney and Ted Deutsch introduced the Carbon Fee and Dividend Act. The official name is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It's also affectionately known as H.R. 763. So far, the bill has 82 co-sponsors from across the nation. The bill proposes that a $15 fee, rising $10 a year, be charged for every metric equivalent of CO2 as carbon is pulled from the earth, be that a well, a pipeline, a mine, etc. All of this money will be put in a trust. After a 3% administrative cost, the trust will be dispersed in equal shares to every American household who has a tax ID, a full share for the adults and a half share for children up to the age of 19. As the price of carbon increases, cost to the consumers will also increase, because those costs are always passed along. But the household dividend will help defray that cost. 80% of Americans will come out ahead or break even, which adds more spendable money to the income, and that leads to job creation. The reduction in carbon in the atmosphere will reduce lives lost and increase the overall health for everyone. Most importantly, we will see a 40% reduction in carbon emissions in 12 years from the bill's enactment. Our feverish planet needs this intervention. So our solution to climate change, it's democracy. We believe that the solution to climate change begins with us as we make our voices heard in Congress, the press, our neighbors, and you, our friends. So thanks for being here. There are a few housekeeping items to take care of before we proceed. The one is that everyone arrived on mute, and we ask that you stay on mute until it's time for questions and answers. At that time, the chat will also be open for questions and answers. And finally, there are many links that Professor Lambert will share with us. If you write to the address ccl Louisville chapter @gmail.com, we will make sure you get all of those. George Perkins, one of our members, is the one who introduced us to Professor Lambert. And so now we're going to ask George to introduce Professor Lambert to you. George? And
I'm sorry you can't see my face, but believe me, you aren't missing much. I first met Tom 10 or 15 years ago. It's hard to refer to him as Professor Lambert. He came to a meeting of a group we had going that discussed the expectation of near-term oil depletion. His economic expertise was a great resource for the group, and he even reciprocated by rashly inviting a couple of us to make a presentation on peak oil to one of his classes. He's been a friend and a target for economic questions ever since. Earlier, he taught at Northern Kentucky University and IU Southeast and has published in the areas of economics and public policy. Currently, he's in the Economics and Equine Industry program at U of L's College of Business. Hey, with that combination, maybe we can get him to give us some handicapping tips. But tonight he's here to explain how taxes and fees can offset the external costs of things like fossil fuels, and to help sort out the aspects and effects of HR 763, the energy innovation and carbon dividend bill that Ruth Ann described, that's the focus of the Citizens Climate Lobby, the local chapter of which is sponsoring this presentation. Take it away, Tom.
Thanks so much, George. It's an honor to be here, and I'm delighted to try to help out and to go through the House Resolution 763, try to hit some of the highlights and talk about it in terms of benefits and costs, as well as, I guess, how economists would see it and how economists would react as well. But thanks for having me, and just really think that this is a good proposal overall. So let's see, I guess I need to share the screen here. Okay, I think that's good. Can you guys see this now?
no, we're still seeing you.
Okay. I guess I need to find a way.
At the bottom of the
Oh, okay. How about now?
it's getting closer, yes.
Okay, good. Forgot that little command there. Can you see the whole thing now?
Perfect.
Okay, great, great. When I was asked to give a talk about this, I've got some of a background in, as George was saying, public policy, and we talk a lot about benefit cost analysis, and we have to go through many times we're asked to review the economic impact of different proposals, different industries, just about everything under the sun. So from a public policy point of view and from an economics point of view, if you will, we talk a lot about this economist, A.C. Pigou, who came up with the idea of taxing things that we don't like, or taxing things that have harmful side effects or consequences, and at the same time trying to subsidize things that are good. So he got into this notion of that there are positive and negative externalities. An externality being something that is external to the transaction between a buyer and a seller. And since we're talking about carbon emissions tonight, you can think of your own purchase of electricity and natural gas from Louisville Gas and Electric being a transaction which indirectly, whether you like it or not, affects other people through carbon emissions. Classic example in textbooks for many years was the emission of having trouble pronouncing it, sulfuric acid being discarded plants over the years. And it says that I'm muted.
No, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Must be something else. I'm sorry. But anyway, the classic example in textbooks was sulfur being emitted through coal powered energy plants, and that being an externality. And, forcing power plants, utility companies to try to reduce emissions, the emission of sulfur, try to limit acid rain for many years. So the whole concept of trying to control an externality is to make it internal to the transaction between buyer and seller, and have the true price of something being produced reflect all of its costs. Not only those to the seller as well as to the buyer, but any third parties who are somehow impacted. Of course, we can also talk about Pigouvian taxes being used to subsidize some good things. We already do that with education, home ownership, there are tax credits. You can itemize on your taxes, or you were in the past, your mortgage interest that you pay, et cetera. The feeling among our policymakers is that these are good things. So, and of course, we try to penalize bad things such as smoking, pollution. We try to make cigarette smokers pay more for smoking through taxes, discouraging their behavior, et cetera. I've looked around at some different costs, come across, and this is provided the link there below. Negative externality of coal-powered energy is approximately 4 cents per kilowatt hour, and for natural gas, it's around 2 cents per kilowatt hour. Some say it's between 1 and 4 cents per kilowatt hour. These are the cost over and above what we typically pay, mostly reflect the carbon emissions that are emitted, harmful to the environment and causing global warming, which I know that, we have some climate change deniers, but I'm of the point of view that I'll take the word of the scientist before I will some of the other folks out there. That's only my personal opinion, but a little more on Pigouvian taxes. What you're trying to do is you're either trying to cause overall demand for the good, creating the negative externality to go down. That's the effect that you want among consumers. Or if you're trying to reduce production, you're trying to shift the supply curve to the left, you're trying to cause producers to cut back their production of the good, causing the negative externality. And again, the goal is to try to internalize the externality. And I'm mostly going to talk about the negative externality of carbon emissions. Here's one thing that I think is interesting to reflect or to incorporate all of the costs of operating a motor vehicle. A good study back in 2006 by Perry and a couple of co-authors, and this is mentioned in the Mankiw textbook, which is a primary economics textbook, and Mankiw is no left-wing environmentalist, to say the least. But they estimate that to internalize all the external costs of operating a motor vehicle, especially the emissions, but also traffic accidents, adequately maintaining roads, etc., gasoline tax should be a little bit more than $2 per gallon. That was back in 2006, so maybe it's $3 per gallon now. You may say, well, that sounds a little crazy. If people did that in this country, we would have a revolution like the Yellow Vest movement over in France about a year ago or 2 years ago. But at the same time, there's the argument that people are really not paying all of the costs associated with gasoline or with operating an automobile. And if you internalize those costs, mass transit becomes much, much more competitive. You know, so anyway, a lot of what revolves around externalities and their cost, a lot of what revolves around those is this concept of elasticity. How elastic is the demand for certain products? Well, we know with energy production, home heating production, electricity and natural gas, the demand is pretty inelastic because as consumers, we really only have one choice, and that's it. The producer really has power over pricing, production, and whom it will take on as a customer. And we know that in those cases, if we try to tax the producer is mostly going to pass the tax along to the consumer. And one of the reasons why I like this House Resolution 763 and similar proposals, there are others in Congress as well, but they're all fairly similar, is that there is some type of way to cushion and to redress the higher costs passed on to consumer, and to also give low and moderate income consumers a little bit extra money, as Ruth Ann was saying earlier. And estimates say 80%, that's 80% of households. Some say it could be 60%, but that's still the majority. So yeah, government intervention is mostly through excise taxes. You can impact the markets through taxation. To use quotas is not a very good idea. You have the same effect, increase prices to consumers, but at the same time, the government gets very little revenue, which means that that money cannot be redistributed or used for other purposes. Yeah, excise tax is a tax is levied on a specific good. Here we got a fee on carbon that's being emitted at the source, from what I understand, at the oil fields, the coal production, extraction from the site. Yeah, we can also talk about tariffs as an excise tax on imported goods. There's a fear that if carbon fees are raised on domestic production here in the United States, that we would import more energy. Well, the bill addresses that. It raises import taxes on imported oil, natural gas, etc. So that's a good idea, in my opinion. Of course, the result of taxes and tariffs is an increase in equilibrium prices, and to also try to reduce overall production and consumption. One of the things I like about this bill is that it gives incentives and money to redirect consumption and production towards renewable energy, greater conservation, etc. Again, what I like about this is that consumers get something back. You're not asking them to bear the whole burden. In fact, they're coming out a little ahead. Most households come out ahead, which makes it politically palatable. So, here's an example. Economists like supply and demand curves. What's the old joke? What do you get when you teach a parrot to say supply and demand, you get an economist because that's all they say, supply and demand, supply and demand. Okay, that's a terrible joke, but anyway, I'm glad that everyone's mute button is on for that reason, but all right. Let's say you have a tax on luxury boats, which has been tried before, and you have a 10,000 tax on luxury, on the makers of these luxury boats. Well, we would expect, with a current equilibrium price of $60,000 and equilibrium quantity supplied and demanded of 600, that the price would go up and the overall quantity demanded and supplied would go down. So the tax moves the supply curve to the left, it's onto the producers. And in this case, we're assuming that the producers can only pass on half of the tax to consumers, the buyers of luxury boats. And so the price goes up to about $65,000. The producers pay about $5,000 of the tax, consumers pay the other $5,000. And we end up with an equilibrium quantity of about 510. And that's pretty much because, the tax is shared equally by both the makers and the buyers. That's pretty much because the way the supply and demand curves are configured in this particular example, the elasticity of supply and the elasticity of demand are fairly equal. Unfortunately, when we get to these utilities, our elasticity of demand as consumers is much more inelastic than their supply. They have much more control over their supply and their pricing, and yet we have few choices out there in the marketplace. So, yeah, a little bit more on the excise tax. I've already mentioned this concept of elasticity. That's the way you calculate the percentage change in quantity demanded or supplied over the percentage change in the price. As I said in those slides, I configured it where those were roughly equal for supply and demand, and the tax is split evenly. But as I pointed out, if the elasticity of demand is actually less than elasticity of supply, then the consumer bears most of the burden of the tax. Examples: gasoline, electricity, natural gas, as I was mentioning. If it's the other way around, then the supplier bears most of the burden. Examples: luxury boats. In actuality, 30 years ago, when they tried that tax, the boat makers suffered more. Consumers of luxury boats went ahead and bought their luxury boats in other countries because they had the money to do that. Vacation destinations, resorts, etc., the elasticity of demand, people can be a little bit more choosier than the producers. So when you're levying these taxes, you have to be careful and consider this concept of elasticity. What is the relative elasticity of demand versus the elasticity of supply? And that often tells you who's going to end up bearing most of the burden of the fees or the taxes, however way you want to put it. So yeah, demand for energy is usually inelastic, fairly strongly inelastic. And so if you calculate that, you get a number that turns out to be less than an absolute value of 1.0. I've already mentioned these other points, and I don't want to run behind. Yeah, the last point: Congress's idea to give tax proceeds back after an administrative cost of, let's say, 3%. I think that's going to help this dramatically, this bill, because I've seen so many of these proposed and yet not do very well or go very far in the past. And here's something by the CBO that I was able to find, which I think reinforces HR 63. $25 per metric ton on most emissions. And if you increase that by 2%, as Ruth Ann was saying, $10 a year, which is supposed to help account for inflation. CBO estimates as much as $1.1 trillion could be generated in 10 years. That's pretty good amount of money that would be generated. The consumers could do a lot with that money, I think, if it's on a per household basis. So even the CBO indicates that there are pretty good, some pretty good revenue generation from this. And I think I read at this on the CCL website that the average after 10 years rebate, dividend, whatever you want to call it, that's given back to households should be over $4,000, maybe $4,400 after about 10 years. And as I was looking at this and looking at the scenarios related to HR 763, you could also have some revenues to invest in renewable energy, try to improve even further. I mean, wind power and solar power are getting more and more competitive and are fairly competitive on a variable cost basis now. And I think some of the revenues from this carbon fee earmarked for that would help quite a bit to particularly lower the fixed cost. I think the future of solar and wind is more emphasis on nanotechnologies. At least this is what the engineers are saying. So I think more research as well as trying to help the production of these renewable energies would be certainly a step in the right direction, because we know climate change is going to cost us. We know that it's the insurance companies are scared to death about climate change. We know that. They're worried about more disasters, having to pay out, more money for forest fires. Urban sprawl is connected to greater forest fires. Despite what's being said about what's going on in California right now, we know that a lot of that has something to do with climate change, greater number of droughts, crop failures, and the insurance companies are aware of this, and they are really scared. I mean, we have the fossil fuel companies probably still in a certain state of denial, kind of like, and this is an editorial on my part, but it kind of reminds me of the tobacco manufacturers denying that cigarette smoking was hazardous to your health, and then later saying, oh, well, it's not addictive, and yet, that wasn't quite accurate, to say the least. Yeah. Initial tax of $15 per metric ton of carbon emitted during the first year. This was the most recent. So with a steep increase of $10 per year in subsequent years, it's a little bit different from the $25 fee, which the CBO was discussing, but still along the same lines. Would result in revenues of some 2.5 trillion after 10 years. So this gets somewhat of a different figure, depending upon how quickly you think carbon emissions are going to go down. Yeah, that was the key difference between the two. Let's see. As the revenues grow non-linearly or exponentially, is what they're trying to say, over time, they could potentially be used to provide dividends to American consumers and incentives to companies to invest in innovation and alternative energy sources. Already talked a little bit about that. Redistribution, investment incentives would be budget neutral. Supposedly higher income households would get less back given what they're spending thanks to the higher fees. I think, there would probably be some pushback by the higher income households, but you would hope politically that the lower and middle income households would be satisfied and speak up, at least that's my opinion, that's going to be the interesting part. We can talk all about the economics, but as I said before, we can, you know, um, the politics is where it's really going to is where the rubber is really going to hit the road, in my opinion. So, some, and I think the PowerPoint slides are going to be posted later, but here are some other sources. There's the CBO review of carbon fees. Like I said, I think they start off with like $25 a ton. Maybe HR 763 is 25. Maybe that was a typo. I'm sorry if it is. That said 15. Maybe that was an error. So correct me if I'm wrong on that. Then there's this other link, energyinnovationact.org, how it works. Then there's this site with Columbia University, their School of International and Public Affairs. They're very complimentary of HR 763 as well as some other proposals. They also, like me, think that it's politically palatable, more palatable to redistribute the money somehow, which I think makes this a very clever idea. And I've already mentioned this. One fear you've got is oil production, natural gas production moving offshore. Of course, the bill addresses that by trying to tax imports higher than what they're being taxed now. Of course, an optimal solution would be to try to get more and more nations throughout the globe to try to start taxing carbon emissions which come from their countries. I think it would be especially a good idea if China did this, China being a big coal producer, although now trying, or coal consumer, now trying to move away from that, however. One good thing for industry is that there are exemptions for fuels used for agricultural or non-emitting purposes. Agriculture is a big user of fossil fuels. Exemptions for fuels used by the armed forces. I don't think in the overall scheme of things that's going to be a huge percentage. Rebates for facilities that capture and sequester carbon dioxide. I think most people can easily see that one. Yeah, and then import taxes and fees on oil and natural gas that's being exported or imported. Another fear, some additional considerations, disruption to industries, fees and rebates to businesses not really addressed in the bill. That's one thing that I kind of noticed when I first went through this. You have agriculture addressed, and it appears exempted, but I was kind of wondering about the others. General Motors, Ford, the big retailers, Walmart. How are they impacted? How are city and state governments impacted? You know, of course, many of the larger ones can pass the higher cost on to consumers, and I would think that through the revenue generated, there's some way to reimburse people for these higher costs. I think a key question is what happens to the smaller businesses. They're not as easily able to pass on increased energy costs to the consumer. So I think before it's all said and done, they'll have to address these more specifically. And according to the EPA, you know, household consumption is about 35%. Industrial consumption, the manufacturers mostly consume about 27% of overall electricity consumption. And then you've got commercial consumption, the retailers, the wholesalers. So, you know, you've got state and local governments. Did some research for a group here in town last week. A huge chunk of the city of Louisville's bill that they pay LG&E is simply for street lights. Big portion of that. So of course we want that for public safety reasons. We want street lights, et cetera, but that is a huge cost. Perhaps my guess is that, I don't know, in the political lobbying and the wheeling and dealing, somehow they'll be exempt. If you're going to exempt the U.S. military, you can exempt state and local governments as well, but that would remain to be seen, I assume, unless something has developed between now and the last time I reviewed my notes on this. But yeah, 60–80% we get money back, greater than what they pay in. My guess is that if this is going to be run by the Treasury, then they'll delegate it to the IRS. They'll probably end up managing the program. Although HR 763, if I'm correct, tries to give people a monthly rebate. If it's the IRS, they would probably prefer to do it on a yearly basis, but that again would be an implementation detail to be worked out. Yeah, these Columbia University economists, as I mentioned before, they've given a pretty positive review of HR 763. However, I don't know. I'm overall optimistic about this piece of legislation, but we've seen some of this before. If you're old enough like me, you probably remember in '92, Tsongas and Ross Perot, they both proposed high gasoline taxes. They both lost. Bill Clinton talked about a BTU tax in 1993. That didn't go anywhere. Cap and trade has been discussed for 30 years now. Still not much on that. In fact, the economist who came up with the idea of cap and trade said he's all in favor of Pigouvian taxes now, instead of trying to have quotas and, letting some type of marketplace, have a marketplace for carbon emissions. That doesn't seem to work very well so far. Will the legislation be enacted? That depends upon what happens in November. I would assume that I'm not a political scientist or anything, but I would assume that if Biden wins and if the Democrats capture the Senate, we're going to have a lot of intense lobbying if this is proposed again, brought back again. And what often happens if you look at the process is that the original piece of legislation gets transformed quite a bit. So would a watered down version have a greater chance of passage, where instead of, I don't know, $25 per metric ton, they changed it to 10 and they doubled the time scale? Who knows? That, as you guys probably know, that becomes part of the negotiation, for the legislation or for the final act. Public choice theory within econ looks at government behavior and policy-making behavior. And that looks at the role of different interest groups, their lobbying, and is often used to predict that whatever is initially proposed usually turns out looking somewhat different than how it was originally conceived. Kind of like the old joke, a camel is a horse that was designed by a committee of 20–25 people. It walks, it runs, etc., but it is not quite a horse. But I guess some classic examples are some past tax reform efforts that we've seen. Reagan in '86 proposed something that was supposed to really make taxes flatter, simpler, etc. But a lot of people said that as far as making the tax code simpler, it didn't accomplish that. It didn't even come close. So people still needed the help of accountants, tax preparers, etc. And even with this 2017 Trump Tax Act, people are still confused. So the original intent of these pieces of legislation get watered down a little bit So, um, so again, I mean, do you change the timeline? Do you lower the rates? I mean, I think it would be great if it passed just as it was, because we need to start really incorporating the cost, and this is just my opinion, of these externalities. As economists preach, there's really no such thing as a free lunch. Uh, Producers and consumers have gotten a partial free lunch by actually paying lower energy costs and gasoline costs than what the price tag truly reflects. So if if you don't like taxing carbon emissions, you can try to tax things at the retail level according to the carbon emissions given out or produced in producing certain products. You can provide rebates on that. Had people, we allow people to estimate the amount of money that they paid in their sales tax at the state level and then get a refund on it. I could imagine something like that occurring, but I think it's better to tax directly the producers. That would be administratively more easy than taxing consumers. You'd be putting a greater burden on these retailers and et cetera. Another thought. U.S. has worked very hard to become the world's largest oil and natural gas producer. It'll be hard for these industries to give that up. I mean, someone posed a question earlier today via email. Do you think that in order to sell their stock of oil or natural gas, that they would be willing to bear the burden of the fees or even lower the prices? Well, that's possible, but large corporations, if you look at their behavior, and in my studies, they like to keep things going as usual for as long as possible. And if they can pass on an increased fee or a tax in order to keep their return on investment or their profit margin or what have you the same, they'll do it. And if these CEOs can figure out a way to boost share prices so that they can earn more money, they'll do it. And if swallowing a tax would cut into their profit margins and also affect the CEO pay as well as managerial pay, they'll avoid it. I mean, that's my opinion, but it's also the behavior that I've seen of these, particularly these large corporations. The smaller businesses are another matter. But anyway, at the same time, as we're leading in fossil fuels, other nations are leading the way in renewable energy. China, Germany. I read in the Wall Street Journal the other day, China is emphasizing only electric cars. They're tired of being dependent upon fossil fuels, trying to scale it back. They're aware of, or they sense that higher costs with fossil fuels are coming down the road, whether it's due to shortages or whether it's due to higher taxes, fees, public pressure to do something about climate change, et cetera. And here's some additional readings. If anyone's interested, if you're interested in the tools of economic analysis, there's this book by Barry Field, discussion of natural resources. I used that in a class that I taught for several years, natural resources economics class. Then there's this classic Herman Daly, ecological economics. Well, he has his co-author now, Joshua Farley. And he's a pretty progressive economist when it comes to climate change and addressing externalities. And then, of course, there's this fairly new book, Big Farms Make Big Flu, which talks about ecological problems perhaps causing the pandemics we've seen over the last 10 years or so. That's kind of an interesting book. But anyway, that's about it. So I hope I haven't run over.
Thank you very much. Professor Lambert, if it's okay, if you'll take your screen off,
Sure.
and then what we'll do is open it up to questions, which means that we are going to do two things. We're going to open up chat, and we also, if you go to the participants box down at the bottom, there is a place where you can raise your hand. So do we have any questions? It looks like we have maybe 7 minutes that we can take questions. I don't see any raised hands.
No, once I gotta raise my hand. Where's the raised hand?
Reaction.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris. We can hear you.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much, Professor Lambert. It's just kind of interesting, some of your discussions. I guess when I think of the carbon fee and dividend, and there's a discussion about not giving any rebates directly to businesses, how does that work? And I guess the thinking is that, like a lot of the big businesses like Amazon, and they're putting in their solar, trying to go more carbon neutral anyway. So they tend to have resources to put in solar panels, wind, and get items. I guess the thing I didn't really think about is how it would affect small businesses, as you mentioned. That the small businesses may not be able to get the renewable energy kind of drive that. So I don't know if there's ideas, you mentioned that, but if there's any other ideas that would kind of help small businesses, they come to mind for you?
You'd have to, I'm just thinking of the political dimensions unless someone has already considered this, but you'd have to give them some type of incentive to participate in this. Probably some type of program that helps them to make the adjustment, or you could, if this is going to be managed by the IRS, and since many businesses are corporations, you've got proprietorships and you've got partnerships, but you could have some type of progressive tax code, I suppose, which if a business's revenues are below a certain level, they get, kind of like with the households, a greater rebate than the larger businesses, if you even want the larger businesses to have greater rebates. I can't see, if Walmart is charged more by utilities to help with climate change, they're just going to somehow factor that in to the items they put on the shelf. A smaller business may struggle with that, worrying that, oh, well, there's somebody down the street who could be able to produce more cheaply than me, and they're not going to raise their menu prices. Let's say if it's a restaurant or what have you. So I think there definitely needs to be redressed. How you do it is another question, whether through rebates, progressive taxation to where the smaller businesses get some money back, small business administration programs, small business administration loans, etc. I think that would eventually have to be addressed unless somebody, and I haven't seen it, has come up with a way to do that. Agriculture is spared, so that's good, I suppose, but that's a heavy user of petroleum-based products.
Okay, we have two other people with questions. I'll call on Wallace, and as soon as you finish, Wallace, Chris has a question, okay?
Thank you.
And again, thank you, Professor Lambert, for am I unmuted?
Yes, you're good.
You can hear me. Okay, my screen says I'm not.
Well,
Hi. So thank you for an interesting talk with some nice perspectives and observations. My understanding of the economy is that if the bill passed with the numbers in it that it's got, electricity prices would go up pretty rapidly. I think we'd see like a 30% increase in 3 years. And possibly food prices would go up because of the increase in cost in fossil fuels. I don't think the prices and other things would rise as dramatically or as rapidly, but it would take people to get a while to get used to, oh, the check I get every month is supposed to offset these higher prices I'm getting that I don't like. And I don't know, what's your perspective on what the scenario I'm spinning out here?
well, you would hope that as time goes by, the carbon emissions would be reduced as people, I mean, if you're trying to project behavior, if most consumers on average would use some of the extra money that they would get to invest in solar panels or what have you, you would also, by putting more money in their hands, encourage entrepreneurs to offer more renewable energy. There would be more opportunities, and that is, you're not really directly subsidizing renewable energy as you are helping consumers demand it. I mean, a check is not going to these firms that create renewable energy, but consumers now have more money, and some entrepreneurs would see an opportunity to provide that service. I think by phasing this in over a long enough period of time, you're giving households, as well as hopefully the smaller businesses and the larger businesses, a long enough planning horizon that they can make adjustments gradually. And so that, unlike an oil embargo where prices go up dramatically within a short period of time, this is, although they will go up, this is a little bit more planned, and it's something that people can manage and deal with a greater amount of certainty. At least that's the goal.
Well, after we have about 3 more minutes, so we have time for Chris to ask his question, and then Isabella has a question. So Chris, you need to unmute.
Okay. So the beauty to me of this bill is relying on the market to do things. And so every time we say, well, let's make an exception for small businesses or agriculture or city governments or whatever, that's distorting the market again. We need to let the market take its place, and people need to pay what they are, that external cost of burning that carbon. If you're a city, you have to pay that. If you're a small business, you have to pay that. You can pass it on to your consumers, and then they're going to be paying their share of what that cost is going to be. But I just love the simplicity of this bill. One other comment, you're wondering about the different prices, the different revenue levels you're talking about, primarily because the different amounts of tax. After 10 years, our bill is going to be, puts like a $115 fee on a ton of carbon. The $25 one you mentioned, going up only 2% per year, would only be $30. So that's why our bill raises a lot more revenue. The question I would have is, how do we come up with estimates for how elastic the market is? If people see that it's going to cost $2 more per gallon after 20 years, how much is that going to induce people to buy more economic cars that can go further. You know, how much will we reduce fuel consumption on transportation if we said, oh, well, there was a $2 per gallon more? That seems like it wouldn't be enough to get what we need to do.
That's a good question. Over a longer time span, the demand for any item becomes more and more elastic. More alternatives develop, so that in the immediate future, a year perhaps, as folks would see gasoline prices go up, you would see, let's say, 10%, 20%, or what have you. You would see a decline in the quantity demanded of perhaps only half that percentage. You know, people still they won't go out and buy a new car right away. They may start taking the bus a little bit more over a 20-year period. And this is the nice thing about the tax. The taxes are giving people the incentive to make the transition. And in that way, their demand for gasoline and the fossil fuels becomes more elastic, particularly as choices develop. Hopefully more electric cars out on the roadway, more mass transportation, more bike lanes if you prefer, you know, depends. Hopefully folks will have more choices and their demand becomes more elastic. And with that, the increase in the price of a gallon of gasoline won't be as troublesome.
Thank you. Okay, Isabella has a question, and then we have one more thing that we need to hear from everybody about, and then we'll just sum it up. So Isabella, I'm going to lower your hand, and if you will unmute, what is the question?
Thank you. This is from Heather. It's on chat, and she wonders what the impact on GDP might be, and how to think about ideal ways to disperse money that's collected to balance economy and equity.
That's a good question. I think the bill, through the dividends or rebates, whether they be monthly or yearly, whether they be tied to your tax filings or not, is a way to make the bill much more equitable and fair to all people. The impact on GDP, you're going to have some disruption. Like I said, the industries that have developed around shale, you know, petroleum, natural gas, and fracking in this country, they're not going to take this piece of legislation lightly. On the other hand, you're opening doors for the market for renewable energy. And at the same time, I keep coming back to, even the conservative economists keep pointing this out, we're really not paying the full price for fossil fuels now. We're really not paying for that. And so you have to come up with a mechanism somehow that incorporates that and makes the price accurately reflect the exploitation of the environment, the exhaustion of some natural resources. I think that's one thing that needs to be communicated to people right now. The health effects, et cetera, asthma through carbon emissions, the potential environmental hazards and natural disasters that are possible through climate change. Like I said earlier, I think the insurance companies deep down, they're fearful of this. So it's a trade-off. There's going to be some negative effects. To come up with an exact number for increase or decrease in GDP, I'm not sure. To say that it's a wash, I couldn't be so sure about that either. You need a big crystal ball to come up with those numbers. But for jobs lost in the fossil fuel industry, you're going to have jobs gained in the renewable energy industries. I think you'd have jobs gained in mass transit. So I think, yeah, it would be hard to forecast. Although there are forecasts made by CCL, which I think are reasonable.
Thank you very much. Now, everybody, if you will look on your screen, there is a poll there. It has 2 questions. And we're asking everybody to please give us your feedback on, the first one is, what other expert would you like to hear from? That one will let you choose 3 items. And then there's another question. We'd like to know how you heard about this. So if people could please vote on that. And then our co-chair, Jean Christensen, is going to wind it up for us. Okay, I see one person has voted. Okay, the votes are starting to come in. This will give us some good information. We're about halfway there. And Chris said he didn't scroll down. So if you scroll down, you'll see the rest of the questionnaire. Thanks, Chris, for the heads up. Okay, just about everybody has done it. So Jean, would you like to send us off to the, and we need you to unmute.
Okay, I would just again like to thank Professor Lambert for sharing his expertise and taking his time to talk with us today. Also thanks to all of the members of the local chapter of CCL who put this program together. I spent quite a bit of time learning about technical requirements. And thanks to all of you who have attended. You will hear from us again. You'll be receiving a short email inviting you to join us in our work in CCL and to help us curb the devastating effects of climate change. Good evening and thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.